Welcome to the One Advantage podcast, exploring the intersections of peer power, culture, and agility. Your hosts, Mike Richardson, Jason Richmond, and Leo Bottary, co-founders of the One Advantage community of practice and advantage peer groups. For more information, please visit us at the One Advantage podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the One Advantage podcast. And unusually, once again, we've got a full house. How does that happen, guys? How does that happen? I don't know. Has Leo run into a problem with his frequent flyer miles or something? Leo's here today. That's amazing.
No, Mike, I think it's the power
I'm here, but I'm not all there.
All right, so we're here with Mike Richardson, Leo Bottary, and Jason Richmond. And we've got a good one today. Been looking forward to this one. How to trounce volatility through trust in an increasingly uncertain world. The 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer revealed that business is more trusted than government, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and media. And businesses appear to be among the last places where people can come together and truly work collaboratively. This places a great deal of responsibility on business leaders to create healthy cultures inside their companies, especially with all the volatility in today's world. That sounds like a good topic for the three of us to get into. But before we do, let's find out who's been where. Leo, you're here. How come?
I am. And I've been home this week. It won't be the case next week, but this week I've been home. Last week was terrific, though. I was in DC and then off to my first visit to Quebec City. I was there for a couple of days and then on to Toronto and, and back home over the weekend. And it's been great, but, real busy and enjoying every bit of it.
Yeah, and I remember you talking about going to Quebec a few weeks ago. A very historic place, isn't it? Beautiful. Did you have lots of snow while you were there?
No, which was good. It was pretty mild. Yeah, I brought the Southern California weather with me. They were grateful.
Yeah. We're getting snow. We're getting snow down here in Southern California, at least on the mountaintops, and they were worried it was going to come down to my altitude of 1,000 feet. So not so far. Jason, are you in Southern California right now? You are, aren't you?
I am. I started out in Denver at about 7,000 feet, Mike.
That's right.
And made my way to Chicago, did some client work in Chicago early on in the week. Came out to Southern California on Wednesday, and I got to be out to work with clients yesterday and all day this afternoon. And I got to tell you, the weather really hasn't been any different in all three places.
That's right. Well, awesome, everybody. It's great to have something really meaty to get our teeth into today. And I know, Leo, in a future podcast, who knows exactly when, you're hoping to possibly get one of the thought leaders from this Edelman Trust Barometer report onto the show. Why don't you get us rolling, Leo? Because I've heard you mention this report many times.
Yeah.
Tell us what do you see in this report that means it's such a pivotal report for you? Who might we get in the future to talk more about it? Let's get the ball rolling here.
Yeah, a quick background on it is the Edelman Trust Barometer is a study of public trust in institutions, government, business, media, and NGOs, those non-governmental organizations. They've been conducting it since 2001 in 28 countries across the world. The number of respondents for the 2023 installment of this was somewhere around 33,000, if I recall. So it's a robust study. The results are announced in recent years, at least, at the World Economic Forum in Davos. So it gets quite a bit of play in that regard, and a lot of people in all walks of life pay attention to it. I've been paying attention to it for quite some time because what we all know, and I think intuitively understand, is that when we don't trust our institutions, and of course, if you follow the trust barometer over the years, some institutions are trusted for a while and then not so much, and there's a bit of an ebb and flow. But when we don't trust our institutions, regardless of which ones they are, we tend to look to one another. And so this idea of the power of peers, particularly as it pertains to the workplace right now, is the subject of looking at the 2023 results, where on one hand, we have this incredibly polarized world, right? And so there's that context that's happening out there that businesses have to operate in, number one. But secondly, they're also looking at the fact that employees recognize that maybe their workplace is one of those last, refuge, the last refuge, if you will, a place where they can collaborate and cooperate and work together and do something purposeful and meaningful. So I think that what is expected of one another, and certainly what's being asked of CEOs today, has changed quite a bit.
Yeah, I was quite shocked actually when I first read the report, and I've heard you talk about it, but I've never really read the report. So it was great to read the 2023 version. It's a big report, so it's there's a lot to it. But I was actually quite shocked to learn that business is more trusted than other institutions, and I thought, wow, that actually surprises me. I guess we're the least worst, right? Everybody else is worse, right? And business is the least worst because we've all worked in businesses where we know there's a trust issue, a culture issue, a core values issue. And we've all worked in businesses where there's been great trust and great culture and great core values. Jason, what would you throw on the fire here?
Well, my immediate take was right off the bat. Edelman's been doing this for 23 years. And from a cultural standpoint, you cannot have a high-performing culture unless you have a high level of trust. It just doesn't exist. And it's not a buzzword. Trust is not the flavor of the month. And if you go through the 23 years of this research, I mean, Leo hit upon it. Back in 2005, they said trust was shifting from authorities to peers, right?
Yeah.
And then you take a look in 2009, it's talking about how trust is plummeting in business, right? And 2015, it's all about trust is essential to innovation. So all these drivers of culture. For 23 years, this report has said that trust is the foundation. 2016 was growing inequality of trust. 2018 was a battle of truth. I mean, 2020 addressed, trust and ethics. And now in 2023, we're living in this polarized world. Yeah. And trust is a foundational pillar of all this. And continuously, every year for 23 years, it's driving culture.
Yeah. And
Jason,
go ahead, Leo.
Go ahead. I just want to pick up on something Jason said that I think has real implications for CEOs. Mike, when you talked about the fact of business enjoying higher trust than that of NGOs, in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, as you might imagine, trust in business was not good.
Right.
And that's an untenable situation you can't have business to be untrusted when you're looking for investors, you're looking at shareholders, you're looking at customers and all these kinds of things. There's no way. So there was a certain intentionality from 2010 on that business really became very intentional about building trust and successful to the point, as you mentioned, where it now exceeds that of NGOs. I think this kind of maybe speaks to something that CEOs who want to be intentional about building trust in their companies to an even greater degree, because by the way, employees still trust one another more than the CEO, but that gap is closing a little bit. And again, I think the more intentional we can be about building that trust, which obviously Jason has suggested is so essential to create any kind of a healthy culture, that I think it gives us a sense of like, it isn't just something that we have to hope. We can be intentional about it. We can make things happen.
That was a very interesting aspect as you get into the depths and the meat of the report. Of course, they start to disassemble trust in business into trust of the CEO, trust of your peers and your colleagues. And as you just said, Leo, it tends to skew more towards, trust in my peers and my colleagues and all of those kinds of things. So lots of really interesting opportunities in there, Jason, for CEOs and the C-suite overall to regain a rebalancing of the playing field in their direction of trust in them. What would you say?
Well, I would say it's prevalent and it was accurate earlier this week. That's what I was doing in Chicago. I was working with a group of executives, and I actually had a copy of this report for them because we talked about what this polarization is, what all this means, and how does that impact the leadership within the organization? And the report talks about 4 of them: the economic anxieties out there, right? And all the leaders in these organizations are feeling some angst and have some anxiety around the economics of where we are right now, the uncertainty, the unknown, institutional imbalance. The other one was this mid-class divide, and the 4th one they talk about is the battle of truth and media and messaging. And we had long conversations about how to control our social media efforts and how do we represent. I mean, this battle for truth is having major impact on organizational cultures through the leadership ranks.
And Leo, this report really talks about polarization, doesn't it? And you touched upon that a few minutes ago. And there's a page in here that I'm looking at right now that sort of lays out this framework of the country by country by country, and which countries are severely polarized and which are sort of modestly polarized or less polarized. And the USA is up there in the top right-hand corner as severely polarized, which I guess is sort of pulling the rug out from under our ability to trust institutions, right? What do you make of that?
Yeah, which is why a lot of this falls on the CEO. The good news is that the CEO does begin on second or third base on this one, which is kind of interesting because if you notice on one of the pages, I loved, because typically it's always that famous poll question, right? Well, what do you think of Congress? Well, everyone hates Congress. They give them poor marks. How about your congressman? My congressman's awesome. My congresswoman, my congressman, they're great. Okay. Well, the same holds true, interestingly enough, for CEOs. When you saw the data, it showed that CEOs in general, the trust on them isn't great. Trust in their own CEO actually was quite a bit higher. Mm-hmm. So I think that being the case, to try to build on that trust, don't take that trust for granted, but really try to use that as a starting block and to continue to build trust. And as we know, it's something we have to pay attention to every day. We can't build trust in our organization and say, okay, let's check out that box and now we can move on. It's a constant, ongoing commitment for people to trust the CEO, to trust one another. And I think for CEOs, also recognizing that because their employees trust one another to such a high degree, right? In 2019, they basically said, and this has been reconfirmed now over time, that the most popular source, the most common source of workplace information is other employees. It's not where they first hear the information, but it's where they find out what it means. Because every time they hear some kind of new change, new initiative, new strategy, boom, they're coming together and engaging one another in sense-making exercises, see this good, bad, or different, right? So if you're CEO, now I'm thinking to myself, okay, who are the people out there among the employee ranks who may not be the most senior level people, but they're really influential with other people? We've got to figure out a way to engage them. Not only getting their input on the front end, but making sure they can be ambassadors for those sense-making conversations for us to be able to create that culture and that trust through and through, not just at certain levels.
Yeah, beautiful. What would you add to all of that, Jason? That whole conversation about CEOs and peers and all of that.
Yeah, and I wrote down some notes in regards to what we're talking about today. And one of the things that jumped off the page for me is why what are some of the drivers of this polarization? And one was this lack of shared identity. And I think from a country, from a government aspect, sure, we can all say that, from the media messages and things like that. But boy, you get inside some of these larger organizations, these companies, from the CEO level down, there is a lack of a shared identity. I am witnessing all kinds of individualism within organizations, even in leadership ranks, that is really driving a lack of trust or becoming a trust buster.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of our work lately and around this type of topic has been around the shared identity, that singleness of purpose, that common rally cry. And there's a lot of angst right now about individualism, and we don't have a shared identity going in as a leadership team or a cohort.
Yeah. Do you mean as a counteraction to that natural tendency to kind of silo? Things tend to silo, and
Yep.
We tend to focus on, job number one, which is our silo and our department and our function. And you know what? If we do our best here, we'll hope that everybody else, can do their best, and somehow magically will be successful. Is that part of what you're speaking to, Jason?
Exactly. That is exactly part of what we're speaking to from an organizational standpoint. Leadership, cross-functional leaders have to come together and have that shared identity. That's going to drive a high level of trust and communication and the ability to be resources for the culture and the workforce.
Yeah. I look at the sort of bottom line of this report, kind of the summary page really advocates for four things. It says, number one, businesses must continue to lead. Number two, collaborate with government. Number three, restore economic optimism. And number four, advocate for the truth. And obviously that's the sort of macro lens they've looked at. But if I go back through those four things and I look at those through the lens of a CEO, business and the CEO must continue to lead. Collaborate with government, I would read that as collaborate with the enterprise, right? Enterprise-wide, enterprise deep. Restore economic optimism, I would read as, restore financial optimism about the future, our profitability, our growth, our sustainability, our longevity. But then the real big one, isn't it, is number four, advocate for the truth, for transparency, for authenticity, for purposefulness and meaningfulness, and all of those kinds of things. What do you see in your work down that kind of line of thinking, Jason? All of those kinds of attributes that people want in their companies.
I mean, it's a common thread. I mean, if you look at our nation from a global standpoint, to our government, to our economic and our media, all the way down to the inner workings of our organization, there's a through line with everything you talked about. Some of the results might be a little bit different, but we're challenged with things like prejudice, discrimination, equality, diversity, inclusion. Without a high level of trust in your organization, that's kind of a component that is going to continually be a challenge for us, right? Yeah. You talked about slower economic growth. Well, that's going to trickle down into slower business growth, right? Yeah. Slower expansion. The level of conflict within your organization. I mean, we've talked for months now about what's going on in our workforces. I mean, it started out months and months and months ago with, quiet quitting, and then went to quiet firing. And then it's all about human behavior, and that human behavior is going to trickle down from the outside inside your organization.
Yeah. And the use of the word quiet, right? Yeah. The use of the word quiet is really a word that's trying to say covert, beneath the radar, invisibly. That's not trust. That's not transparency. That's not authenticity. That's that's in the shadows, as it were, isn't it? Leo, what would you add into this conversation?
Two things. One, with regard to truth, I think we can do a lot in our organizations to help people with what Edelman has previously described as having better information hygiene. The idea that when we take in information and it seems to conform or comply with exactly how we see the world, then we don't vet that information oftentimes, right? It's that confirmation bias. It's that, and I think that when we hear certain things, we need to start vetting the sources of that information. We need to get, as anyone would, a second and third, opinion on whether what we're talking about here is true or not. And I think in business, when we're trying to make decisions, we need to make it based on facts and based on truths. Oh. And so the more disciplined we can be about that for one another, I think the better. I think there's another element of this, though, that comes into play, and that's with our workplace has never been more diverse. Just speak to the generational piece of this for starters. We know, for example, that baby boomers are much more inclined to be trust first. That's not the case with millennials or Gen Zs. Okay. So now it creates a whole different expectation around transparency and about all of these kinds of things when it comes to building trust in an organization. So I think there's a lot of challenges out there, but I think incredible opportunities as well.
Yeah, everybody. Go ahead, Jason. Go ahead.
No, and with that, I don't, from an organizational standpoint, if you're a Fortune 100, a Fortune 500, if you're a startup, if you're mid cap or a small business, from a CEO level and a leadership level, it's our responsibility as a company for our business to continue to lead, right? To be able to demonstrate leadership, to be able to treat employees and customers, with a high level of trust, respect, credibility, everything we've talked about. But this component of businesses themselves actually being leaders within their community, regardless of your size or scope or industry you're in, I think in order for us to get through any type of wave or uncertainty or polarization, I think that's where it starts.
Yeah. And what I really like about this report is, we've said for many years, haven't we, that often leaders need to make visible the invisible, and trust might be one of the most invisible things. And yet here we've got a report that I think you said is in its 23rd year that has been making tangible the intangible of trust. And I think, what we're saying, everybody, listeners, is that trust is kind of like the gas in the tank. The rest of the vehicle, this highly engineered vehicle that you call your business, and all of the horsepower, all of the suspension, all of the cockpit is not going anywhere fast, or as fast as it could be, or as agile as it could be, if you don't have plenty of gas in the tank called trust.
Yep.
And what level of fuel do you have in your gas tank? Are you running on empty? And what can you do to start filling that back up? And, I'm reminded of, I think it was Stephen Covey Jr., not the original Stephen Covey, but I think it was Stephen Covey Jr., who wrote a book called The Speed of Trust, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, I could substitute the word agility, for speed. If you want agility, you're going to have trust. We talk about a peer-powered culture of agility, don't we? Culture is that core word, and the bottom line of culture is trust. Jason, what would you add to that?
Nothing. I think it was perfectly said, Mike, and that's kind of my leaving thought, right? Culture has been around since the beginning of time, and you do not have a high-performing culture without a high level of trust within your organization. It just doesn't exist.
Yeah. And Leo, what else did you take away from this 2023 report? Were there some other things that sort of stood out for you and caught your attention that we should mention?
No, there is, and I think one of the things, though, it just struck me that your car analogy I loved. This idea of trust being in the tank. The other way I think about the car, too, is that, you've got this trust in the tank and you have this vehicle that has all this technology and the leather and the beautiful stuff and all that kind of thing, right? When the reality is that the only thing touching the road are the tires. So, right? So when the rubber meets the road, as they say, do you have all the platitudes and values and all the lofty thinking and all that? So that's one thing. But what are you doing day in and day out to make sure that when the rubber meets the road, that you're doing the kinds of things that are necessary to build trust? And so I think as we look at, this entire topic, I want to really, and I think we all do, want to encourage people to dig deeper into what are the things very specifically they are doing. What are those overlapping, consistent, continuous practices that we're engaging in to make sure that we are, building the level of trust in our companies that we can. And I think that is kind of an essential part of, just doing the best we can to impact the people closest to us in our families, in our companies, in our communities. And I think if we can each take a leadership role in doing that, we can go a long way toward reducing the level of polarization. I mean, I hope not to be reading about this 3 to 5 years from now in terms of this getting worse. I'd love to see it, start to improve.
Yeah, that polarization issue is I think one of the most alarming things of this report, and how severely polarized many countries are, not least of all the USA. Of course, we see that play out, every day in the media, in the news, in social media. We see these tribes that just don't listen to each other anymore, and we're not going to get into politics, on the show here. But I think, Jason, when we were talking about siloing, that's another form of polarization in a business, isn't it? Right? It's the front end of the business, sales and marketing, sort of feeling polarized from the back end of the business, production and purchasing and accounting and all of that. And really, we got to bridge the divide, don't we? Because if we're a polarized company, we are not going to enjoy the speed and agility of trust. What would you say, Jason?
I would agree. Build the bridge, right? Don't build ladders, build bridges. Yeah. And, and it can be a bridge of trust, but it takes time too. And you can't just say it. It's not something you just make an announcement, send a memo. I mean, this is something you got to demonstrate, live, breathe, behave differently in order to keep focusing on a high level of trust in your organization.
Yeah,
go ahead, Leo. I just wanted to pivot to what really follow up with what you said too, Mike, regarding silos, because that has to. The only way those silos get broken down is trust, and it begins with an executive leadership team who doesn't come together as they sit around the table as the king or queen of their departments. Being concerned about their budget and their people and their pet programs and all these kinds of things. They have to be able to put their enterprise hat on in order to truly serve the organization. But the only way you do that is you've got to have an incredible level of trust among that senior leadership team to make that possible. And this is where they, I think, have to set the tone for the rest of the company.
Yeah, and of course, that, everybody, is where peer power and peer innovation and the peer-powered culture of agility really comes to play. Because if you can, one of the ways in which you start to build those bridges across those functional pillars and departmental silos and all of that is start getting people into a room, close the door, and be able to talk and explore and share the tensions, the challenges, the explore the horizontals, as you say, Leo, between the verticals, right? The gold is in the horizontals between the verticals, and how that scaffolding takes shape as a stronger architecture of a platform on which the business can go onwards and upwards. Just talk more about that, Leo, because that really is the heart of what your passion and purpose around peer innovation is all about, isn't it?
Yeah, there's no question that there's an inordinate amount of attention paid to the vertical structure in companies, right? It's like my, EVPs, my senior VPs, VPs, directors, managers, and I got this whole thing, and I got this matrix, and all of that, and it tends to be a lot of, especially in larger companies, thought of from a very hierarchical standpoint, and there's far less attention paid to the fact that what runs horizontally through your company gives that vertical structure strength. This is where silos are reduced. This is where people are communicating, and they do it with intentionality and trust and a common understanding of what the purpose and goals really are. And, this is where I think the genius of this study that, again, has been being conducted since 2001. There's so much to be learned from it, whether you are in business, government, media, or as an NGO, because it is at the crux of it all, is trust.
Yeah. And I'm just here on my browser, everybody, and I just typed in Edelman Trust Barometer 2023. It takes you right there. So just go to your browser, everybody, and type that in, Edelman Trust Barometer 2023. It takes you right there. So everybody can find this easily. And Leo, we may have, hopefully, somebody that can join us in the future from the thought leadership team over there and share more. That would be really exciting if we can pull that off.
Yeah, I'm thinking there's someone who actually knows what they're talking about on the subject. We'll bring them right in here. It'd be great.
Yeah,
No,
so
it'll be a lot of fun.
yeah.
They're really good. And I said we've been paying attention to this study for a while, but there's no question that if the opportunity to speak with someone who's really in the trenches of what this is all about and really be able to get some insights that may not be, in the report, if you will, I think would be, a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah. Jason, any final thoughts from you before we land this plane?
No, I'd keep it in the forefront. Make it purposeful, right?
Yeah.
And check that report out. The
Yeah.
insights you gain, there's a lot of ahas in there that's going to make you think about a few things differently. And it's going to make you look in the mirror and analyze a little bit about what's going on in your organization right now. I encourage everyone to check it out.
Yeah. Edelman Trust Barometer, EDELMAN. Edelman Trust Barometer. There we have it, everybody. Another One Advantage podcast coming to an end here. What a delight it was to have a full house. We'll see if we can keep that going with Leo's travel plans in the future. And join us again in the future, hopefully, to have a deeper exploration of the Edelman Trust Barometer. But for now, that's it, everybody. We'll see and hear you, or you'll hear us again in a couple of weeks. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the One Advantage podcast. If you liked this episode, please consider helping us by rating us wherever you listen, spreading the word, having us as a guest on your podcast or webinar, and mentioning us in social media. Find us at the One Advantage podcast, where you can get more information about us and this episode. Thanks again for listening, and we look forward to more great episodes to come.